Page 82. Part 6. A fundamental distinction must be made between emotions and feelings, because, in complete contrast to the philosophical and psychiatric and psychological schools of thought, they represent two completely unlike factors, which in their form have nothing in common with each other. Feelings, namely, are created as a result of particular lines of thought, while emotions are reactions which are called forth by particular situations and states, and in forms which are specific to the individual, as well as forms which are external and environmentally conditioned. So, emotions are therefore able to create thoughts through which particular feelings are created, which then formatively influence the psyche and, in turn, the thoughts. A cycle thereby comes about through which the emotions can also be influenced and formed via the thoughts by means of the feelings. However, so that emotions are created and can manifest, a process of perception is required from which arises a particular interpretation of a physical state of excitation. This state of excitation can exhibit many kinds of forms and can arise from feelings, observations, and experiences, as well as from external circumstances, events, and situations, and so forth. Joy, laughter, sorrow, and crying are human states of excitation which are subject to the brain's interpretation. It therefore processes the information and stimuli and determines to what extent and in which form the bodily states must be interpreted and expressed. So, for example, as joy or ill humor, as sorrow or gladness, as euphoria, as love or hate, and so forth. And all these states of excitation of the body and of the consciousness are fundamentally based on thoughts, through which the corresponding feelings are created, which must simply be defined as states of excitation, among other things. Thus it also follows again from this that fundamentally and exclusively the thoughts and their might are again responsible for the fact that feelings, and with that the resulting states of excitation, can come about at all in the human being. The fact of the matter are thus unambiguously clear. The facts of the matter are thus unambiguously clear. The might of the thoughts is decisive in the forming of feelings, and with that, these corresponding states of excitation of the body, the consciousness, and the psyche. Thus, the thoughts in no wise play a subordinate role, rather quite the contrary. They play an absolutely dominant role in the entire process of the forming of the consciousness and psyche, just as they do with the creation of the feelings by means of which the psyche is indeed formed, as are certain emotions. As explained, emotions are not to be equated with feelings, because a great difference exists between the two. Emotions arise completely spontaneously from some sort of internal or external situation, and are hard to bring under control by means of the thoughts. They are in no kind and wise based upon feelings, rather solely on internal or environmentally conditioned external perceptions of situations, events, experiences, and impressions pertaining to the body or the consciousness. Emotions thereby arise completely spontaneously and so quickly that they practically cannot be recognized before they become noticeable. Additionally, with the occurrence of emotions, a strong state of excitation arises, from which also a state of warmth often or mostly comes about, which primarily manifests in the head, however, which can also spread to the entire body. All of this is in contrast to feelings, which, as a rule, are built up consciously, in certain cases also unconsciously, by means of lines of thought. Consequently, their emergence can be recognized, perceived, and observed as well as controlled. Naturally, states of excitation can also arise as a result of feelings, however they are not associated with a state of warmth, as is the case with emotions. In contrast to emotions, which cannot be steered, feelings can be very well guided, and led in particular directions, simply through the kind of thoughts and their might. As already explained, not only a conscious, rather also an unconscious thinking occurs, whereby exactly the latter can be especially dangerous for the psyche, because it simply cannot be consciously perceived, and, for that reason, cannot be controlled. Thus, the human being's cognitive process, that is to say, the processing of information, entails much more complexity than is involved in purely conscious thinking. The processing of information carries in it not only multi-layered reflexive processes of the nervous system, rather simply also unconscious automatic thoughts, which, just as the word indicates, are not consciously perceived. The concept of information processing must be extraordinarily broadly defined, so that the operating psychical neurological mechanisms of the processing can be described or outlined. Besides, it is already almost impossible to make such a sharp distinction between emotional processes and those pertaining to feelings and cognition, so that everything can be precisely differentiated. But both the cognitive factors, as well as the factors pertaining to emotions and feelings, are stimulus processing mechanisms of the human body, which is enlivened by spiritual power. And all these factors have a common and quite extensive cleavage plane, which makes it very difficult for the uninitiated, for unknowing ones, the layperson, and the misinformed philosophers, psychiatrists, psychologists, and the like, to see and to acknowledge volitional thinking and its might as the potency from which the state of the psyche is actually formed, or with which a disturbed and sick psyche is healed again. When it is claimed by certain psychoanalysts, psychotherapists, psychiatrists, philosophers, and psychologists who are without understanding and lose themselves in irrational opinions, that a multitude of findings prove that a considerable component of feelings could be caused relatively independently of mental groundwork, and even independently of cognitive groundwork, then this does not only correspond to an erroneous assumption, rather to an evil, irrational opinion or irrational teaching. Also, it has nothing to do with emotions, which influence the entire life of the feelings, and which are essentially primary, as is unknowledgeably and erroneously asserted. Emotions and feelings must be strictly separated, because emotions are reflexive, spontaneous manifestations, while feelings, in every case, emerge slowly and are formed through the world of thoughts. And exactly thoughts, as was already explained, also arise unconsciously and automatically, and, as a result, unconscious information processing procedures also occur. Cognitive pre-processing is thus also performed unconsciously, which self-evidently leads to unconscious feelings, through which, in the same wise, the psyche is influenced and its condition is formed. Therefore, by means of their might, thoughts can create structures, forms, and qualities of feelings very well. Conscious or unconscious thoughts determine and stimulate not only a pattern of feelings, rather truthfully very much more, and included in that is also the state of the psyche, its health and equalizedness, or its disturbed state and its sickness. Something further to say concerning emotions is that also unconscious stimuli of some kind, as for example electrical or electromagnetic influences, are able to cause such reflexive spontaneous processes. The occurrence of emotions is therefore not necessarily built upon conscious perceptions, such as in the form of experiences, events, impressions, situations, and so forth, of a corporal and consciousness-based internal nature, or of an external nature outside the body and consciousness. On their own, certain radiations or electrical and electromagnetic influences are already able to cause emotional impulsations, resulting then in the thereby affected human being not knowing at all from which cause his or her emotions arise. On their own, the electrical or electromagnetic vibrations of a fellow human's brain can actually already be sufficient to evoke uncontrollable emotions in another. And naturally, in such a case, there is also no cognitive process, thus no mental pre-appraisal, because such emotional reactions appear completely reflexively and spontaneously. Thus also no internal or external stimuli arise in reference to which the human being concerned could locate and judge the origin of the emotion. At best, a human being, if he or she is practiced and knowledgeable about it, is able to locate certain centers of the brain from which the emotions issue. However, this requires healthy practical experience over many long years, and the actual knowledge of how the consciousness, emotions, thoughts, and feelings, as well as the psyche, actually function. Merely studying matters of psychology, psychiatry, psychotherapy, psychoanalysts, and philosophy, and so forth, is in no wise sufficient, because the doctrines of these schools of thought still run too much along wrong lines and lose themselves in erroneous assumptions. Emotions are spontaneous, reflexive reactions of certain centers in the brain, which not only exercise their function with the human being, rather also with animals. Thus also with animals, emotions become evident which are based on the same factors as are those of the human being. However, animals are not able to contemplate their emotions and the reasons they appear, nor are they able to correspondingly create feelings from them, because in keeping with their kind, animals are only able to develop their own feelings through instinct and drive. Thus, in this regard, no comparison can be drawn with the conscious thinking of the human being, even though animals have their own consciousness, because the animal's consciousness is only formed with a consciousness of instinct and drive. Consequently, it is not able to create any conscious, evolutive, and creative thoughts. Nevertheless, however, animals also have feelings which are of a kind which is simply instinct conscious and drive-based conscious. Therefore, in animals there exist no conscious fundamental processing mechanisms and none of this evolutive kind and wise, because such are solely reserved for all kinds of human species.